Welcome to Food for Thought. Today's episode is Equestrians, Cavalries, and Hippos, horse-related words. Before we begin, my name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. At joyfulvegan.com, you can find signed copies of my books, my 30-day vegan challenge, and my online cooking classes, both my on-demand classes where you get recipes and videos, as well as my upcoming live online classes. At joyfulvegantrips.com, you can book one of my all-inclusive vegan trips, including upcoming trips to Rwanda, Botswana, Tuscany, Northern Italy, and more. This podcast is listener supported, so if it's something you value and you would like to enjoy some perks, including bonus content and transcripts to all of the episodes, just head over to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau to become a supporter today at your chosen level. Thank you so much in advance. If you are a subscriber and listener of this podcast, Food for Thought, or of the limited run spinoff podcast called Animology, which you can still get wherever you listen to podcasts, you know I'm very interested in the animal-related words and expressions we use every day in the English language. And you would know that I call those animal-related words and expressions animologies. You would also know, if you've listened, that we have already talked about horse expressions. The obvious and the obscure is the name of that episode. Today we're going to delve back into horse-related animologies, but this time we're going to focus on horse-related words rather than expressions. And because horses factor so significantly into our English lexicon, this episode is only part one of two. So let's get started, and let's start with the word horse itself. The word horse is an old English word that dates back to the 800s, goes back a long way. Its pronunciation has really remained the same, though its spelling has changed a little bit. The Old English word was pronounced horse, but it was spelled H-O-R-S without the E. As far as the exact Proto-Indo-European roots of that Old English word, in other words, where that Old English word horse came from, it's possible that it's connected to the Proto-Indo-European root K-E-R-S, meaning to run. And the reason I am going back as far as the Proto-Indo-European roots of these words is because, as I talked about in a previous animology episode called Animal Characteristics in Word Histories, Who They Are in What We Say, I talk about the fact that when we examine the origins, the meanings of the Old English words and the Proto-Indo-European roots for these animals, for the names for these animals, what we see in the etymologies themselves are sentient animated beings with distinctive features, facets, and relationships. So, for example, whereas the word beef in English simply means flesh of a cow or steer or bull to be eaten, right? And mutton in English simply means flesh of a sheep to be eaten. When you look at the roots of the words for the living animals, because beef and mutton are both Norman French words that came in after the Norman invasion. But if you look at the Old English and the Proto-Indo-European roots of the words cow or steer or bull or sheep or lamb or deer or pig, for any of these words for the living animals, you see a clue about the animals themselves. So, for instance, the Proto-Indo-European root of the word bull is spelled B-H-E-L. We don't know how it would have been pronounced in Proto-Indo-European languages. That's the whole point. These were not languages that were written down. This is a reconstructed language based on evidence. I'll just leave it at that. And I talk more about that in animology. But that Proto-Indo-European root, B-H-E-L, meant to blow or to bellow. And it is also a verb stem combination that's found in some German dialects, meaning to roar. And so that says something about the animal, the bull himself, right? That word bull actually reflects a vocalization of that animal. And so that's why I love talking about the Proto-Indo-European roots. Because if we just say bull today, you think, oh, a bull, a big bovine with horns, but there's more to it than that. And that is evident in that root. And so just to finish off the analogy, if you look at the word sheep, so again, mutton just means the flesh of that animal. But if you look at the Old English word for sheep and for ram, both of those words meant strong. And of course, they are strong animals. And so that's what I love, is that hidden in these Old English words and the Proto-Indo-European roots of these words for the animals who were used and kept and killed for human consumption, they're clues about the physical, behavioral, or vocal characteristics of the living animals. It reflects a tendency to name animals based on typical attributes or activities, and we still do that today. And so while the Old English word horse just means this equine animal, when you go back further to the Proto-Indo-European root for the Old English word horse, you have the root kers, meaning to run. And that's why I wanted to tell you about that, because I can't think of a better word. I can't think of a better verb. I can't think of a better way to describe these animals, because, of course, when we picture horses, we picture them running. And additionally, when we go back to the Proto-Indo-European root for the Latin word equus, right? So horse is an Old English word. Equus is the Latin word for this animal. We have the Proto-Indo-European root OKU, which means swift. So again, running, swift. These faraway roots reflect the significant characteristics of these beautiful animals, right? I can't think of better words to describe horses than run and swift. So take a listen to that episode if you're interested in more of that, more examples of how the foundation of our English language reveals our admiration for other animals. But let's look at some other English words for these equine animals. Because, of course, horse is kind of a generic term, but we also have stallion. Stallion refers to an adult male horse who has not been castrated. The implication, of course, is that they're kept for breeding. Similar to the word bull, in the bovine realm, bull refers to an uncastrated male, and steer refers to a castrated male. Just the same here. Stallion refers to an uncastrated male, and gelding refers to a castrated male. Gelding, to geld is to castrate. So stallion is a word from Middle English, coming in from Norman French, but it has Germanic roots as well as Proto-Indo-European roots in the form of the root stel, which meant or means to put or to stand, with derivatives referring to standing in place. And the reference is probably to a horse who would have been kept in a stable to service mares, mare being a female horse. And yes, if you're paying attention, stel, which turns into stallion, you can also detect the connection between stel, meaning to stand, in the roots, in the words stall and stable. So a stallion is kept in a stall, in a stable, and all of those words share a common root meaning to stand in place. So I would say that stable and stall are etymologies in the sense that, it wasn't people or things who were kept in stalls and stables. They were non-human animals. And so I feel like that word is an etymology, but I'll delve into that deeper another time. But just to finish up stallion, the slang use of the word stallion to refer to a virile or lascivious man is attested from the 1550s. And again, if you're starting to think etymologically, you might be thinking of Sylvester Stallone, the American actor. He was called the Italian Stallion. I didn't make that up. But he was, or probably still is, called the Italian Stallion because Stallone, or it would have been pronounced Stallone in Italian, is Italian for stallion. Stallone, Stallone, stallion. Okay, so Italian Stallion. There you go. What can I say? So as I mentioned, Mare on the other side of stallion is the female adult horse. And by the way, you can use the word stallion and mare for other equines, such as donkeys and mules, but we're just talking about horses today. So like horse, mare, M-A-R-E, is an Old English word. Its Proto-Germanic roots seem to just mean female horse. So that's really all I have for that one. There's no significant characteristic being reflected in that word. It just means female horse as far as we can see. But for gags and giggles, You might recognize the word mare in the word nightmare. And if you have, well done. It is an English compound word meaning a dream arousing feelings of intense fear, horror, or distress. But at one time in the 1300s, when the word nightmare was coined, a nightmare was actually a female spirit or monster who was supposed to settle on and produce a feeling of suffocation in a sleeping person. They would kind of sit on that person on their chest and create a feeling of suffocation. That was a nightmare, was a female spirit who did that. And the mare in that medieval word actually has a different root than the word mare in our word for female horse. So I just want you to, if you're starting to think that way, which I love, I just want to let you know that that's not the same root. Of course, you would not know that. It's spelled the same way. How would you know that? It's actually a Germanic root meaning goblin. So it has nothing to do with horses. A night mare was a night goblin. But there is another English word that I know you're familiar with that does come from the horse-related mare, but I'm going to save that for its own special category. We're coming up in a couple minutes on that. But let's move on to foal and filly, both of which are from the Proto-Indo-European root Pulo, meaning the young of an animal. And we've talked about this root before when we talked about the words pullet or poultry, both of which come from this root Pulo, meaning young animal. So a foal, and there was a sound change between P's and F, so that's why there's a relationship actually between poultry and foal. There actually is a direct etymological link, but we're not going to get into that today. But a foal is an equine who is less than a year old. This is FOAL, of course. And more specifically, a colt is a male foal and a filly is a female foal. Okay, so basically it just means a young equine under 1 year old. And essentially after they're a year, they're a yearling. They're called yearlings. But let's wrap these English words up. Let's wrap up these words for horse with a couple more, including a familiar word that is the word pony. And a pony is just a small horse of any breed. It's also from that same root, meaning little young foal. You've got steed, which I think is a bit archaic at this point, but you'll still see it and hear it perhaps in literary works. The word steed, probably familiar enough that it's worth mentioning. In Old English, it was steda, Steda, and it meant stud. So you can see that connection there. And again, like stallion, it was essentially a word to refer to a horse kept for breeding. Now, interestingly, the word stud, before it referred to a male animal kept for breeding, and obviously before it became slang for a virulent human male, stud, was an Old English word for the place, for the establishment in which stallions and mares were kept for breeding. So a stud was a place, and then it became the word for the animal himself. Eventually, it came to mean the male horse used for breeding. And then in Middle English, steed came to mean a great horse. So it went from stud and then steed to mean a great horse or a war horse or a spirited horse. And that was to distinguish this great war horse from a palfrey. And that is Palfrey. And again, I think you'll hear that and see that in literature, though we don't tend to use that. If you're in the horse world, perhaps you use it all the time, but I don't think we really use that today. And that was to refer to a horse that, ladies rode as opposed to a war horse. At this point, I feel like I need to just interject and acknowledge something that you might be thinking, which is you're hearing me talk about war horses and you're hearing me talk about horses, riding horses and that kind of thing. This episode is not about kind of horse-related issues and ethical issues around, having horses be used in combat and riding horses. That is going to be its own separate episode. Can you believe 16 years into this podcast and I haven't actually spoken specifically about some of the issues that I know come up a lot and questions I'm asked a lot about horseback riding and et cetera, et cetera. So just know that this episode is about our language, and I'm not going to deny the fact that we have words today that came from the fact that we bred horses and breed horses and ride horses and rode them and brought them into war, etc. This is about that, this episode. But we will talk about the ethical implications of all of those things in a different episode. So those are all different words to describe different types of horses from Old English, but we also have the Latin word for horse, and we said earlier that's equus, E-Q-U-U-S. Now I mentioned already that the Proto-Indo-European root E-K-W-O or E-K-U may have meant swift. And of course, the Latin word equus, from the Latin word equus, we have the word equine, which means related to horses, or the adjective used to describe the characteristics of horses, equine. We also have equestrian, which means related to horseback riding. And we have Equus, the name of a play by Peter Shaffer, written in 1973. And it tells the story of a psychiatrist who tries to treat a young man who has a pathological fascination with horses. That's why it's called equus. But those Old English, Proto-Indo-European, and Latin words are not the only words we have to describe these animals. We also have another Latin word for horse, and that is caballus. Caballus. C-A-B-A-L-L-U-S. And believe it or not, you're most likely familiar with a number of words that come from this Latin word, caballus. Caballus is probably how you'd pronounce it, meaning horse. First, we have the word cavalry, the collective term for horse soldiers, that part of a military force which consists of mounted troops, right, as opposed to infantry, as opposed to those who are on foot. Basically, a cavalry is a unit of troops on horseback, right? Now, when motorized vehicles became a thing, the word expanded to refer to a mechanized cavalry. So it could be a group of armored cars as well. Kind of any modern army motor vehicle that is meant for warfare. But originally and etymologically, it comes from the word for horse, meaning mounted troops. You also have another word from this Latin root, and that is cavalier. Now, cavalier has a few different meanings. In the proper noun sense, cavaliers were a group of 17th century English poets associated with the court of Charles I. So Charles I, they're also called the Cavalier poets, but you're most likely inclined to use the word cavalier as an adjective to describe someone who is arrogant or dismissive, right? Such as saying someone has a cavalier attitude toward the suffering of others, or cavalier attitude toward the suffering of animals, right? Cavalier. It could also mean carefree and nonchalant, but the word cavalier goes back further than that from the Old Spanish word cavalero, meaning horse rider. So horse riding cavaliers or cavalleros, they were basically knights, and they could get pretty haughty, they could get pretty disdainful, they could be pretty arrogant, giving rise to the adjective cavalier that we use today. In French, they would have been called chevalier. Now, chevalier is a French pronunciation. Chevalier is another way to say it. But in the late 13th century, we had the rise of this word chevalier, and it's an Anglo-French word meaning mounted knight. So again, from that same Latin root. And it just means a knight or a horseman. Now, the word knight itself really does tend to refer just to a person mounted, like, a man on a horse who was following these particular codes of conduct. So hold that thought for just a second. But the word knight itself doesn't come from the word for horse, so I didn't want to include it here. But basically, a chevalier was a knight or a horseman, also from that Latin root. Now, these knights, these chevaliers, could be gallant and brave, which is why we have this related word chivalry and chivalrous. And so chivalry was this code of conduct, this medieval system, this set of principles, these customs of knighthood. And they were essentially the qualities idealized by the concept of knighthood: bravery, courtesy, honor, gallantry, especially toward women. These are all considered chivalrous qualities, which comes from our Latin word for horse, because someone who was practicing chivalry was a knight who was mounted on a horse. That's basically the connection there. You also have another word from that Latin root, and that is the word cavalcade. came from Latin, but through Italian, which means a procession of riders or horse-drawn carriages. It means also a ceremonial procession or a display, but it would have originally been of horse-drawn carriages or people on horseback. And then it progressed in a more general sense to just mean a succession or a series, such as he starred in a cavalcade of Broadway hits, right? So it just means a succession or series. And that word comes from Old Italian cavalcata, from cavalcare, meaning to ride on horseback, from that same Latin root. So from Latin caballus, we have cavalry, chevalier, chivalry, chivalrous, cavalier, and cavalcade. Now, Old English and Latin are not the only languages that have words for horse that came into English. We also have the Greek word for horse, and that is, I'm going to wait for it. Can you guess it? I know you know this. We've talked about it before. Are you saying it now? The Greek word for horse is hippos. Hippos, hippos is the Greek word for horse. Now, first of all, we have Hippocrates, the name of the renowned ancient Greek physician born around 460 BC, and his eponymously named Hippocratic Oath. That's the oath of ethical professional behavior sworn by new physicians, like the do no harm oath. That's the Hippocratic Oath, although apparently it may have been written by a student or a contemporary of his, but it's attributed to Hippocrates. His name, consisting of Greek hippos, meaning horse, and Greek kratia, meaning rule, literally means one superior in horses. Okay, so he was superior in a lot of things. So that's Hippocrates. Hippodrome. Today you might think of a hippodrome as a music hall or a theater featuring variety shows or circuses. That's what its original meaning was. In fact, there is a hippodrome today still standing in London. It's a building on the corner of Charing Cross Road and Cranbourne Street in the city of Westminster in London. And it's called such because the name hippodrome was used for many theaters and music halls hundreds of years ago. And the London Hippodrome is one of the few survivors of these music halls that were called hippodromes. So a hippodrome is from Greek hippos plus dromos, meaning course. So the reason it's called hippodrome is because originally in ancient Greece or Rome, a hippodrome was an open-air course for horse and chariot races. So hippos plus dromos, hippodrome. And then it became just a general term for theaters for variety shows or general circuses, etc., not necessarily animal related. Then you have a word that's probably a bit more obscure unless you know your Greek mythology, and that's Hippocrene. David knew it right away. David used to, when he was a teenager, he just memorized all of the Greek gods and goddesses and all of the stories. And so a Hippocrene was the mythical fountain on Mount Helicon, and it was a fountain that was sacred to the Muses. Its waters were held in high esteem. They were supposed to bestow poetic inspiration to the Muses, and that was the Hippocrene, and that's from Greek hippos, meaning horse, plus crane, meaning fountain. So Hippocrene is basically a horse fountain. Hippology means the study of horses. It's pretty archaic. We don't really use it today. There's not a lot of words in the English language that came from Greek hippos, but hippomania or hippophilia means having fondness for horses. Hippophobia means having a fear of horses. Hippotherapy is probably still used a bit today. It's the use of horse riding as a therapeutic or rehabilitative treatment, etc. And we'll talk more about that when we get into horse issues. And in ancient Athenian society, the hippius, and again, this is another word for knights, it was the second highest of the four social classes. So the Hippos was the class of knights on their armored horses. Their counterparts were the Roman equestrians and the medieval knights. So that's just another word. And then we have a number of animals named for this animal using this Greek root, which I love. You ready? So one already is the hippopotamus. So hippopotamus, we've talked about this in previous episodes, means very poetically river horse. And that's what this animal was originally called. He was coined a river horse from Greek hippos, meaning horse, and potamus, meaning river. Then you have the hippocampus. We've talked about this too. I talk about this in my TEDx talk on animologies. You have this part of our brain crucial for long-term memory. That's the hippocampus. And the hippocampus was named by an Italian anatomist in the 16th century who thought that this area, if you look at a picture of it, you can see that it's kind of suggestive of the curves of the hippocampus's tail. And the hippocampus was a mythological sea creature who was part horse and part fish. So if you look, it kind of looks like this creature, but this is where things get really interesting. This creature, this hippocampus, this mythological sea creature, is basically a seahorse, right? So those little lovely marine fishes who have a head and neck suggestive of a horse, they're called seahorses. Well, their genus is the hippocampus. That's the genus that the seahorse is in. There's a couple other little animals, similar animals in that same genus, but the seahorse, the genus of the seahorse, so again, you can hear the horse in there, the genus of that animal, that marine little fish, is the hippocampus. I love that. I love that. So you have the hippos, meaning horse, and campos, meaning sea monster. So again, referring back to that Greek sea creature, that mythological sea creature, who apparently pulled Neptune's chariot. So that's the seahorse and the hippocampus. And then you have another animal named for a horse, using both the Greek word and the English word for horse, and that's horsefly or hippofly. So those massive, large, biting flies, they're called horseflies. They tend to be found near rivers in Central and Southern Africa. They're called horseflies because they're so large, but they're also called hippoflies. So you can see why now. There's the hippo centaur, which is another mythological animal that's worth mentioning. I don't know why you need the hippo centaur, because a centaur was already a race of monsters having the head and arms and trunk of a man and the body and legs of a horse. And a hippo centaur seems redundant, but hippo centaur is another word from that Greek word for horse. And then our final animal named for a horse, or named after a word that meant horse, though not having Greek origins, is walrus. What? Walrus. Walrus seems to have come from Old Norse, an Old Norse word, Rossvalar, so Hrossvalr, meaning horse whale. Now the word Rossvalar was inverted into the Danish language as Valros, or Swedish Valros, which you can hear Valros, Valrus, Walrus, Walrus, and that dates back to the 1650s, the word walrus, 1650s, coming from that Old Norse word meaning horse whale. So there you go. Not only is walrus an animal, but the word walrus is a horse-related animology. Okay, so those are animals named for the word horse, and we're going to talk about people's names named after horse. But let's first take a look at some professions named after horses. Okay, so first off, we have the word constable. Constable, and if you can picture the spelling of that word, Constable, stable, constable. Generally speaking, a constable is a person who holds a particular office, most commonly in criminal law enforcement. In the UK, a constable tends to just be a police officer. In the United States, there's no consistent use of the office of constable throughout the states. A constable may be an official responsible for like issuing summonses and subpoenas for people to appear in court. But it kind of vacillates a bit more, whereas in the UK, constable tends to be a police officer, probably of a certain rank. But in any case, the etymology of the word involves horses. Historically, the title comes from the Latin word stabuli, attendant, which meant an attendant to the stables. An attendant to the stables, literally a count of the stable. Okay, and it originated from the Roman Empire, originally referring to the officer responsible for keeping the horses of a lord or a monarch. That's what a constable was. And then it just became broadened to refer to anyone in law enforcement, or maybe specified. But constable is related to horses because it was originally the officer who was responsible for keeping the horses of a lord or a monarch. An equivalent position is that of a marshal. Marshal, now this is Marshal, not two L's, just one L. And a marshal derives from Old German, the Old German word Mara, okay, Marah, related to the source of our word mare, by the way, related to the source of our word mare for female horse, right? And Mara meant horse. And then another part of that word meant servant. So marshal originally meant horse servant or stable keeper, or more familiarly, groom. In the first known uses of the word in documents written in England, marshal was used with the meaning of farrier, someone who cared for the feet of a horse and shoed the animals. So a marshal is a holder of various military, law enforcement, and other positions. When I think of a marshal, like as a law officer, I think of them having duties similar to those of a sheriff, carrying out the judgments of a court of law. And I think of marshal with two L's, but that's different than the marshal that we have, like a field marshal as in a military rank, right? Or a fire marshal, like a fire safety inspector, or a U.S. Marshal from the U.S. Marshal Service, or marshal as in a sheriff, but they all mean horse servant. Moving on to an entirely different type of profession, and that is one who is an attendant at a gaming table, a gambling table, like who manages and collects payments and bets, right? A dealer or croupier. I don't know if you've heard of the word croupier. I have. I grew up with a father who is a professional gambler. I don't know if you knew that, but I know that term because yeah. So croupier, it's Croupier, obviously a French word, is someone who is appointed at a gambling table to assist in the conduct of the game, especially in the distribution, as I said, of bets and payouts. Croupiers are typically employed by the casinos. But believe it or not, croupier is a horse-related etymology. So it's a French word referring originally to someone who rides behind another on the croup or the rump of a horse. Croupier. Of a horse, that the back end of the horse. Hence, the meaning broadened to refer to anyone who backs up another, who's a second. Originally, a croupier meant one who stood behind a gambler with extra reserves of cash to back him up during a gambling session. But the word derived from croup, meaning the rump of a horse, and was, by way of an analogy, someone who rode behind on horseback. So I think that's very interesting. Another horse-related etymology is one we don't think of as a profession today, but a word that once referred to a profession, and that is henchman. A henchman today is a loyal or trusted follower or subordinate, especially one who engages in unscrupulous or criminal behavior on the leader's behalf, right? They could be a loyal employee or supporter or aide to some powerful figure engaged in probably nefarious or criminal enterprises. So henchmen are typically relatively unimportant in the organization, but their value lies primarily in their unquestioning loyalty to their leader. But that's not what it was originally. Originally, the term referred to one who attended a horse for his employer, like a groom, like a horse groom. Hence, like constable and marshal, a henchman was originally stable staff, but then became the title of a subordinate official in a royal court or noble household. How did that become the case? Well, etymologically, the first part of the word, which is recorded in English since 1360, comes from the Old English hengest, Hengest, meaning horse, notably stallion, from some Germanic languages. So that's how we have henchman, referring to someone who is in the employ of a nobility in the stables. And today, as I said, it's someone who has unquestioning a loyalty to someone higher than them. Then you have the word knacker. As far back as the 16th century, you have the word knacker to refer to someone who was a harness maker or a saddler. The word is of uncertain origin, possibly from a dialectical survival of a Scandinavian word related to neck, knacker, neck. But by the early 19th century, a knacker was one whose trade was to buy worn out, diseased, or quote unquote useless horses and slaughter them for their hides and their hooves, and making dog meat, what have you. Essentially, a knacker became a horse slaughterer. And finally, while this is not a formal profession, and we'll talk more about knacker because we're going to come back to knackered. But finally, while this is not a profession, but rather a regular activity that's done for enjoyment, we have the word hobby, which is horse related. The word hobby came into English around 1400, and it meant originally a hobby was a small or middle-sized horse, essentially a pony, a small horse. Even by the 1800s in certain dialects in Britain, and especially in Ireland, the word hobby was used to refer to a small horse. But by the 16th century, we also see the term hobby horse to refer to a toy horse made of a wooden or basket work frame with an artificial tail and an artificial head designed for a child to mimic riding a real horse. And by the early 1800s, that English word hobby to refer to an activity pursued for pleasure or relaxation came into the language, connecting the notion of an activity that doesn't go anywhere, like a toy horse. So that's how you have hobby, which meant small horse, and then hobby horse, which referred to this child's toy, and then the word hobby itself, which referred to the idea of doing something where you're not really getting anywhere because you're not doing it for financial gain or what have you, like the toy horse. So there you go. There's some professions. And then the reason I wanted to go over some of those professions before I got to people's names is because from one of those professions, we have a surname and a first name, and that is Marshal. So as I mentioned, Marshal, like in Field Marshal, that's Marshal, but typically the spelling for a person's surname or first name would be Marshal with two L's. But a Marshal, if your name is Marshal or your last name is Marshal, it's someone who cared for horses. Then we have the word Phillip, which I don't know if you knew, but it's from the Latin Philippus, from Greek Philippos. And if you look at the word Philippos, you can see hippos in there. So from that Greek root hippos, meaning horses, and then the first part meaning to like, you have Philip meaning fond of horses, and you can see it, or to love, philos, meaning to love. So you have Philip meaning lover of horses, or someone who's fond of horses. And that's Felipe and Filippo and, Philippe, Phil, all of those are the same thing. And then relatedly, we have the Philippines, which is an archipelago, of course, in Southeast Asia. And it literally comes from the Spanish Islas Filipinas, which meant the islands of Philip, referring to the King Philip II of Spain. And so his name, Philip, which already meant lover of horses, of course, the Philippines are named after him because his name means lover of horses. The Philippines refer to horses. Now, I'm throwing this one in because we've talked about the word chevalier, and, that comes from the Latin word for horse, but I thought I would name a specific person whose name you may have heard of, and that is Maurice Chevalier. He was a well-known French singer and an actor and an entertainer, so his name is an etymology. And then you have names like Rider, R-I-D-E-R, or R-Y-D-E-R, which needs very little explanation. The only meaning of the word rider as a first name or a last name comes from a mounted warrior or a knight or just someone riding a horse. You have the name Rhiannon, which is actually from Welsh mythology. This is Rhiannon. And Rhiannon was the name of a Welsh horse goddess, a character described to be wearing shining gold clothing and riding a pale-colored horse. So she is strongly associated with horses, as is her son, and they're often depicted as a mare and a foal And so you have another girl's name in this case for named after the Welsh horse goddess. You have another female name, which means gentle horse in its original Germanic language, and that is the word Rosalind. A variation could be Rosalind or Rose or Roslyn, and that's Rosalind, Rosalind, and it means gentle horse. From the first part of the word, you can see we kind of talked about the Scandinavian roots of walrus earlier, so Hros, that's a Germanic word for horse, and the second part, Linde, Linde, means tender or soft. And so, of course, that's a very famous character in one of Shakespeare's plays, As You Like It. And so Rosalind is a horse-related name. Then you have one that's going to be very unfamiliar to you, again, unless you know something about Greek history and philosophy, and that is the name Xanthippe. Xanthippe, probably Xanthippe, also pronounced Xanthippe, Xanthippe. You can see that Hippe, you can see that Greek word for horse. She was the wife of Socrates, Xanthippe, and you can see xanthos. We've talked about xanthos, and we've talked about xanthocyanins, which are a kind of phytochemical, which are yellow. So the word xanthos is Greek for yellow, and hippos for horse. So her name means yellow horse. She apparently wasn't a very nice person. She was described by contemporaries as very shrewish and scolding. And unfortunately, today her name is associated with any woman who is peevish or a nag. And that last word, nag, is where we're going to next. It's another horse-related etymology, and I'm grouping it with kind of words that we use as insults or kind of more on the negative side, not necessarily insults, but you'll see. But before we go to these insults, and you will know most of these words, and I'm sure you use them every day, I want to just take a moment to thank my amazing supporters, especially my angels, Brooke Boussard and Michal Stone, my heroes, Angelica Lofton, Jennifer Statmiller, Jennifer Watkins, Geraldine Hilmar, PG Schuster, Ranjini Mohan, and Tina Strassheim. I know you've heard these names before because they have been supporters for a very long time. And if you want to join them as angels or heroes, and you can see the different levels at my Patreon page, patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, you can be one of these names that I name in this podcast to thank you for your support. Today's featured supporter is a new supporter. Her name is Donna at $20 a month. She is our newest superstar. Thank you so much, Donna. That's the $20 a month level. If you would like to join Donna and our angels and heroes or besties and benefactors, go to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thank you so much. And don't forget, we have our patron-only event coming up, which you would have heard about in your account. So head over there if you haven't seen it yet, or just reach out to me if you want details. And it's for anyone who has been a patron in the past and anyone who is a patron now. We've got a really fun virtual event coming up just for you. Okay, let's move back to this category, starting with the word nag. As long ago as the mid-14th century, we have the word nag to connote a small riding horse or a pony. And from there, the word nag became a slang word for an elderly or worn-out horse. As such, that horse might be ill-tempered as a result of health issues or poor care or ill treatment. And so the story goes that the practice of referring to someone as a nag, usually a woman, started because of that. Someone who resembled an old nag, an old horse, who was ill-tempered, who complained, who was demanding, and now we have the word nag to refer, again, mostly to women as someone who's demanding and complaining and ill-tempered. From that meaning of the word nag to refer to a worn-out horse. I'm not entirely convinced by this, but there's so much out there on it, and it really is kind of the most popular folk etymology about the origins of this word. And yeah, I'm willing to share it with you because you will find that everywhere, but there's also some other possible derivations more from a Scandinavian side, but I'm willing to say that. But what you probably didn't know is that a nag actually was a small riding horse that turned into a horse who was elderly or worn out. In the 14th century also, we have the word jade, which was a contemptuous name for a horse of inferior breeding, like a cart horse as opposed to a riding horse, right? So like a very like worn out, kind of worthless horse. Again, this is not my language, but that was what a jade was this kind of worthless, worn out horse. Then by the early 1600s, the expression to make a jade of a horse meant to exhaust or wear out a horse by driving them or working them too hard, to weary them, to fatigue them. To make a jade of a horse was to tire them out. And not long after that, in the later 1600s, that expression, that word, became expanded to our current meaning of being jaded, as in being tired or worn out, or being cynical and pretentiously callous. And so that came from the original meaning of jade being a worn out old horse. That I can confirm and corroborate. That is true. Harridan is a word that's probably a bit more archaic. It's a word you'll most likely see also in literary works like the word steed. And since it's a horse-related etymology, I wanted to mention it here. And plus it's kind of in the realm of this kind of like these old horses who we have these different names for, who then got translated to not only refer to a person who is kind of cranky and old, but women. So you see a lot of these kind of misogynistic words, which is not surprising in the way people treat horses to the way women were treated. And so you have the word harridan. That's Harridan. A harridan is a critical, scolding woman, right? But it seems to come from a 17th century alteration of the French word haridel, which meant an old, thin, worn-out horse, which was then, of course, transferred to refer to an old, gaunt woman. So this isn't as much of an insult, but we talked about knacker as a job, as a profession of someone who slaughtered horses, especially worn-out, tired, again, useless, not my words, horses. And so that word got extended to mean exhausted, just generally speaking, to be completely tired out. This is mostly a Britishism. You hear people talk about being knackered, being super tired, super worn out. You don't hear that as much in the US, but to be knackered means to be worn out. And it comes from the word knacker, which was someone who killed worn out horses. And then finally, in this category, you have the word tacky, which we use today to connote something that's in poor taste, right? By 1800, though, it meant a degenerate, inferior horse from the earlier meaning of the word tacky, which meant an ill-fed or neglected horse. Later, it was extended to persons who were in like condition and thus lacking style or good taste, someone who's tawdry, offensive. So it is a horse-related etymology. And all of these words, tacky, harridan, jaded, nag, knackered, all come from the idea of a worn-out horse, which says a lot about how often people saw worn out horses, because remember, they were used for everything from not only for consumption, but also for pulling plows and, of course, pulling carriages and being ridden and brought to war, etc. So they have been through quite a bit, and we will talk about that in another episode. And then our last category for this episode, which is just part one, is words we have from body parts of horses, but also to describe body parts of people. Okay, let me just go into it. So first we have a Charlie horse, right? Something everyone has suffered from, a Charlie horse. That horrible stiffness or cramp you get in your leg, your foot, your arm. It goes back to before the late 1880s. The origin is obscure, but we do know from the 1880s, we do see that expression being used. Again, I'm not really convinced as to how it became an expression, why it's a horse. There are some really sweet folk etymologies about an old horse named Charlie who was used in the old Chicago White Sox ballpark to pull a roller across the infield, and he was old and his muscles would get stiff and he could hardly walk. So players and spectators who saw him thought of him when they would get a cramp, and so they would call it a Charlie horse. A little too cutesy for me. Whenever there is an etymology or an origin story that's just too neat and tidy, I'm just a little suspect. We have another one that is pretty obvious. I think it's self-explanatory, and that is ponytail. And this is a horse-related word that describes our own physiology, a hairstyle where you pull the hair back and you fasten it with a little tie, and it hangs down, and it looks like a pony's tail. This is different than pigtails. That would be a different episode, but pigtails would be another example of an etymology. Then we have the cauda equina, and this is a explicitly named horse-related body part that is the bundle of nerves at the base of the spinal cord, named for its resemblance to a horse's tail. Cauda is Latin for tail, and of course, equina is Latin for horse. Speaking of tail, we have the word curtail, which of course means to restrict or limit, to cut short. And it comes from the Old French word courteau, which comes from the Proto-Indo-European root meaning to cut, S-K-E-R, meaning to cut. And so the spelling in English, like curtail, it might have been influenced by Middle English. So you see that in the Old French was T-A-U-L-T at the end, and that kind of got changed in Middle English to T-A-I-L. And it's a reference to horses with docked tails, to cut short, to curtail. Gambol is a word that we have, a verb to describe leaping about, playfully, frolicking, and it's an alteration of the French gambade, which means horse's jump. A horse's jump. From Old French, it's possibly from Old Italian, gambata, and that comes from late Latin, gamba, which means a horse's leg. A horse's leg. So the verb gambol, G-A-M-B-O-L, is to frolic about, and it comes from the Latin word for horse's legs. And that leads us to a slang word for human legs, particularly women's legs, and that is gam or gams, like she's got a nice pair of gams. Now, you probably would hear this like in the 1940s, like if you watch old movies, you would definitely hear this. I've heard it in lots of old movies. So gams was a slang term for women's legs because it comes from that Latin word gamba, which means horse's legs. So it comes from that. So gams. And then jam, as in J-A-M-B, as in a door jam. It's also from that same late Latin word gamba, meaning leg, meaning horse's leg, right? So when you picture a door jam, it's the side piece of the opening of a door or window. And so just imagine two side pieces of the frame as legs on either side of the opening, legs. And so jam, like door jam or window jam. And that's different than jam, like being in a pickle or being in a traffic, congestion, or preserves, like fruit preserves, different jam. That's J-A-M. But J-A-M-B comes from horses. So jam, gams, gambol, curtail, cauda equina, ponytail, Charlie horse, tacky, knackered, harridan, jaded, nag, Rosalind, Phillip, Marshal, hobby, knacker, henchman, croupier, marshal, constable, walrus, hippofly, seahorse, hippocampus, hippopotamus, hippodrome, Hippocrates, cavalcade, chivalry, chivalrous, chevalier, cavalier, cavalry, equestrian, equine. All of these words come from Old English, Latin, Greek, Indo-European, German, etc. And all of these words are words that have come into our language, into the English language. I say our language because it's the language I speak. Our language, the English language, from the word horse. Because horses were and are, but certainly were so prevalent in our development as humans, in our civilization, in all of the ways, for better or for worse, that we have grown, eaten, plowed, transported, all of the ways that we have lived as human beings, horses have been there with us for a very long time, for better or for worse. And so it's no surprise that we have so many words and expressions. So go back and listen to the horse expressions episode in the English language. So there are more. That was just part one, but it is time to close and it is time to frolic away. I have no clever way of leaving this. I'm just going to bow out and say, for the animals, for the horses, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thank you for listening.